Hello and welcome to the CS4 interview. Joining me this week is Dr Roman Frigg from the London School of Economics, who later on is going to be talking about some important fundamental limitations that we need to take into consideration when we're doing simulation activity. Roman, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be in Southampton.
All right, thanks. Now, you are a philosopher.
Yes.
You're a professional philosopher. This is your job.
Yeah.
And there are philosophers around, we do know that, but what brought you to wanting to make philosophy a career?
Well, I guess it was one way to sort of resolve the schizophrenia I've always suffered from. I always had sort of a double interest in physics and philosophy, so ever since I was a teenager. And then I found this field called philosophy of physics, and I thought that's wonderful, so that allows me to do both. And it just so happens that philosophers of physics, they are homed in philosophy departments these days rather than in physics departments, so that's how I ended up living in a philosophy department. Okay, but your kind of day-to-day job is, well, I don't want to characterise what a philosopher does, but maybe some people think that you, after you check your emails, you sort of look out the window and ponder for 8 hours. So is it quite an interactive experience working with scientists? Yeah, it is quite an interactive experience. I mean, the kind of philosophy I like is very much a style of philosophy that's not shy and sort of you go out there and make your hands dirty. So I like to talk to scientists, I read science journals, and the project I'm going to present later is actually joint work with two physicists. So I think philosophy should not be too self-referential. Actually, philosophy should look towards the real world, so see real world problems and talk to people who deal with them, and try to add something to what they do by having a critical angle, by stepping back sort of a little bit, sort of let all the dust settle and think carefully. So that's the philosopher's job, but you shouldn't be busy essentially just thinking about yourself. So this is just sort of a bad way of doing philosophy, I think. And philosophy of science is always somewhere in the middle between what one could describe as pure philosophy and science, and I quite like being there, so it's just one of the things I feel quite comfortable with.
So you think that the philosophical activity that you do in collaboration with other scientists, that has a kind of an immediate impact or benefit to the scientists who are actually doing the science at the time, or is this something that maybe people need to think about at some point in the future?
Sometimes it does have an immediate effect, yes. In particular, the talk I'm going to present later on, I hope that people would take these lessons or the points I present into account in the day-to-day work, and that certain things actually change and certain practices change and certain things are done in a different way as a result of the philosophical work done. It can of course not be denied that some problems are farther removed from the day-to-day work. Take sort of an evergreen in the foundations of physics is the quantum measurement problem. That's a very interesting problem, philosophically speaking. However, the day-to-day work of a physicist is often not very much affected by which stance you take on the quantum measurement problem. I think this is sort of a grey scale here, and I don't want to judge it at all. Sort of some results are more on that side, some results are more on that side. So personally, I prefer to be a bit on that side.
Okay. So you mentioned quantum mechanics, and there are many popular science, popular philosophy books about quantum mechanics and maybe some of the more esoteric aspects of theoretical physics. So when you say philosophy of science, perhaps people would think that these, the structure of the universe, the mind of God. But the thing you're going to be talking about today might appear to be a little bit more mundane or practical, which is, what happens when you run or formulate or structure a simulation. So what are the kind of philosophical issues are there surrounding simulation activity?
There's a number of issues. it's a time-honored problem how you represent something. So, ever since antiquity, philosophers worried about philosophy of language or how pictorial representation works. What does it mean to make a representation of something? A lot of science is representational in one way or another, and in particular if you build models, at least some of these models are taken to be representations of a particular target system. Now you want to understand how this representation works. I mean, what kind of beast is that representation? How can you work with it? How can you understand it theoretically? There's a number of questions there. Some are more theoretical than others, and the very practical question is, what kind of idealizations have you made in constructing a model, and what sort of claims can you legitimately base on the idealization you have made? So a standard move in physics is that you idealize things a little bit when you construct a mechanical model of an ice skater, for instance. You assume that the ice is a perfect plane and there's no friction at all. Now that is in some sense close to the truth, but it isn't the truth because you don't have a perfect plane and there's some friction. Yet the results that you get from a model that makes these idealizations are, in a sense, close to the real world, and this is exactly why these models are often useful. So, but that's one way of idealizing things, and that need not necessarily work in all cases. So the work for the philosopher here is to look at different kinds of models, study different kinds of idealizations, and worry about whether sort of the standard inferences you want to draw from, say, mechanical models can actually be drawn from all the models you have. And sort of the point I want to argue later on is that you have to be careful in some cases. So things are not always as simple as they seem to be.
Okay. So all models are wrong, but some are more useful than others. So there's the impression that one gets sometimes is when you talk to somebody who's built a simulation of something is that it must be true or it must be useful because it's got lots of bits of the target system in there. So it's and if you have a model that's got more bits of the target system, then it must be a better model because it's more realistic or it's a more faithful representation of the target system. And so there is almost a suggestion sometimes that the simulation data is almost like a form of empirical data. It's something which is giving you knowledge in and of itself. So presumably you would have a few issues with that? Or?
Yes, I would urge some caution.
Okay.
So just slapping a lot of detail into a model does not necessarily make it a good model. And the fact that tampering with a model has a phenomenology that's very similar to making an experiment doesn't turn modeling or running a computer simulation into an experiment. So it's a point one often hears that experimentation has now been replaced by computer simulation, and these simulations provide you data that can be analyzed just like data you generate in a normal experiment, and if taken without further qualifications, that seems to be overstating the case. There's no guarantee that something that has a lot of details in it that somehow close to the original system actually produces results that have any resemblance at all to how the real thing behaves. So small modeling error can have large effects, and so you have to be aware of that. So building a realistic agent-based model, say, where realistic means that you get most of it somehow right, doesn't at all imply that the predictions you generate have anything to do with how a real system actually behaves. And, so if you want to jump to that conclusion, you surely have to provide an extra argument as a backup.
So yeah, working out the colour of people's shirts and then putting it into an agent-based model doesn't necessarily make it much any more useful at all. In fact, it could be possibly counterproductive, right?
Yes. But even if you put in things that are relevant to the case at hand, probably shirt collar is not, then you don't have a guarantee that the results are correct. I mean, your utility function, say, may be only slightly different from the utility function of some of the real actors, and these effects may multiply, and what you get out as a result is rather different than what reality would look like.
Mm-hmm.
Or in the case I'm going to talk about later, you move probability functions forward in time under the dynamics of a system that is almost true dynamics. So you get really very, very close. However, that being a little bit away from it really makes your predictions go completely off. So the real world and your predictions really come fundamentally unstuck. And you wouldn't expect that because your model actually is very good. So I don't think there is sort of one recipe to follow, but you just have to be careful in what exactly you do, and sort of just putting more detail in may not generate ever better predictions. So this is not necessarily a good thing. It can be in some cases, but it need not.
Okay. One of the problems that people often have when they're building simulations, whether it's an agent-based simulation or some other kind of simulation, is the perennial problem of model validation. We don't have data in order to validate the model with, or to assess the model, or and a particular irony is often people use simulation approaches because there is this absence of empirical data. So they're almost cast as a kind of a thought experiment, or a what if. A tool for thinking about things, which presumably is okay, but it's when you want to make firmer claims, kind of the epistemological status of those models.
Yeah, exactly. See, if you say it's a tool for thinking, that's wonderful, no objection here, and often sort of little toy models are very helpful in understanding causal mechanisms. You understand the feedback loop, and all this can be very valuable, but if you then suddenly say, hey, now let's run the real model run and generate predictions for how things actually behave, then you're in a completely different ballgame. And then sort of slightly different rules apply. And if you want to do that, and you want to do it with some confidence, you really must be sure that your model is on the right track, and in the absence of data, that's often very, very difficult. So you better be on your guard. And if you have, say, linear models, you have sort of a meta theory that gives you estimates of how far you're going to go off, etc., etc. But especially in nonlinear models, there is little by way of use for meta theory. And so then you just have to be careful, and you really would have to be absolutely certain that your model is not only sort of a good model, but generates the right predictions. And you often don't have this certainty, so you'd better be on your guard and use these models, as you say, for thinking about a system, understanding qualitative features, but don't try to generate precise numerical predictions with them.
So you mentioned sensitivity to initial conditions. So you may think that your model structurally, the way you've built it, is a good and useful model. But as you start undertaking, ideally what you should do is undertake the kind of sensitivity analysis and explore parameter space, and then see does that result, does it withstand certain changes of parameter values, or is it incredibly sensitive to these kind of initial conditions, which you would imagine that lots of non-linear, or having lots of non-linearities in the model might produce. So maybe I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit now. You've got these very, very complicated models with tremendous amounts of non-linear feedbacks, which are tremendously computationally expensive and take a very long time to run. But they seem to be our best bet at the moment of understanding maybe climate dynamics, let's say, or increasingly vegetation dynamics, dynamical vegetation models, which are very expensive, very complex, most probably quite sensitive to initial conditions, or at least driving. What should we think about these kind of models? They're not predictions, and I think people who work in the area are very clear that they're not predictions, but what should be their status?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, let me start at the extreme end. It's not true that people don't generally think they're not predictions. I mean, increasingly these models are actually used predictively. In particular, here in the UK, we have a project, UKCP09, who makes very detailed predictions for up to the end of the century, actually, about how climate change will affect local areas.
Yeah.
And these are clearly offered as predictions, and policymakers are advised to pay attention to these things. Now, I'm skeptical about this for the reasons sketched. I mean, these models are extremely complex. They have all kind of idealizations made, and they use techniques that we just have no reason to trust fully. So that is just sort of a fact that we have to live with. And so I think these models are very valuable in understanding qualitative features. I mean, when you calculate the increase of mean global temperature, and you have certain feedback loops, and you understand the sulfur cycle or whatever it is. I mean, these models really provide a lot of very useful information about these systems, but they shouldn't be used predictively on a small scale, I think.
Certainly, I mean, relatively small, like a regional scale, the variations or the variability that we would expect.
Well, UKCP09 offers predictions on a 25-kilometer grid. That's really very, very fine grained, and well, it may be that the predictions are correct. Of course, we cannot say the predictions are wrong. I would submit, though, that the epistemic warrant that we have now, that these predictions for, say, 2080 are actually trustworthy, is very thin. And, well, this is a long discussion what the reasons for this are, but one of them relates to what we're going to talk today. Is it's not only about exploring parameter space, because when you explore parameter space, you effectively say you got the right structural form of the model, and you're just uncertain about the values, but that's already a huge claim. I mean, how do you know? I mean, maybe your equations are completely different, so and all the methods used there, they can't be used to sample uncertainty that would be of the kind that attaches to the model structure per se. Maybe this is a completely different functional form, and sort of stability analysis in the parameters doesn't provide you information about that. And in particular with something as complicated as the climate, we don't have very strong reasons to believe that the functional form of current models is the correct functional form, and all the uncertainties we have are uncertainties about the parameter values.
So one way in which you would want to increase your confidence in, let's say, the prediction of a GCM is its ability to hindcast. So, you know, for the model to faithfully reproduce previous climate data. So you have the model and you spin it up, and then you give it a data set, and then you see how well it does over the last 100 years, given that we've got reasonably good measurements for 100 years. And then we kind of let it go. Either as under a different kind of scenario, perhaps, business as usual, or maybe a high growth scenario where there's lots of CO2. Presumably, if you think there are important sensitivities to initial conditions, or you might not even have the correct structural form, there must be a great deal of uncertainty about the kind of predictions that kind of modelling activity will produce, even if it still is very well fitted to previous empirical data.
Yeah, exactly. I would agree with that. I mean, there's several problems. First, I mean, fitting to previous data is obviously not a bad idea, but there is a real problem of of essentially overfitting. So you can always fit your model to past data because these models have so many free parameters. It can always be done. And then the problem is we get into the whole climate modeling business because we know exactly, and it's on a philosophical point, that the future will not be like the past. And so we are in a transient system. So even if you get the past right, it's not guaranteed that you get the future right because the physics is different. Or rather, not, well, I should qualify that it's not that the fundamental laws of physics, they of course remain the same, but the way they play out in the current setting is almost different. And so the fact that the model gets the past right need not imply, it can of course, but it need not imply that we get the future right. So again, this is just a point to urge caution. So I wouldn't sign a statement saying that the current models are false. They may be right, but how do we know? That's the very hard epistemological question, and we can't answer that question just by appeal to successful past fitting.
I mean, fortunately, climatology can tell us a lot about what we would expect a planetary climate like the Earth to look like as you increase radiative forcing, and it must be the case that let's say IPCC reported scenarios, they could be a lot worse, couldn't they? I mean, you may see 2 degrees warming, it could be 5, there could be all these inherent positive feedback loops, tipping points that start interacting. Permafrost melting, ice caps sliding off into the sea.
Plenty of stuff can happen, and again I think these models are very useful exploring scenarios and in telling us what could possibly happen, so what's within the realm of a possibility, so what scenarios could we be faced with. But if you then take one of those things and say, well, now I'm going to predict what happens in 2080 in East London, then you may be guilty of overselling your case a little bit.
But do policymakers need that? Do they need that, epistemic warrant, scientific truth, with the stamp of scientific truth, to then go and make progress?
I must say this is something that has puzzled me endlessly, because climate science seems to be the only domain of policy making where policymakers are at least claimed to demand this sort of evidence. I mean, when you have to overhaul the NHS, no one wants to have precise numbers of beds used in 2080. You obviously deal with uncertainty on a day-to-day basis when you're a policymaker. Just in the climate case, they have somehow convinced themselves, or have been convinced by others, I don't know what the causal history here is, that they can get their hands on precise data. And, well, my recommendation would be that's sort of a pipe dream, so say goodbye to that. Of course, if you could have it, well, that would be wonderful. I'm not against using the best evidence you have to make sensible policy. However, if you sort of overstretch that, and if particularly stretch it beyond breaking point, you risk that you're fooled by certainties that actually are uncertainties. So it would be more sensible to recognize the inherent limitations we have and make sensible policy under these uncertainties. I mean, that's more difficult, I agree. If you know exactly where the water is in 2080, that's more convenient, but well, it's probably better to acknowledge that we can't really know that than to sort of what's the nice way of putting it, than to being in the dogmatic slumber of thinking that you know it all, make nice plans, and then nothing works out in exactly that way.
Yeah, being wrong, but being really, really accurately wrong.
Yeah, being accurately wrong. There's something heroic to it. Probably we want to be pragmatic rather than heroic, I think. So.
Okay. We don't have much more time left, unfortunately, but I do want to ask you one particular question. Some of our students here, so we have a doctoral training centre, we've got about 75, nearly 80 PhD students who are doing a whole range of simulation activity, and some of them are interested in working in areas which they will hope to inform policy.
Yeah.
Some are looking for, you know, relatively refined academic endeavours after they graduate. What would be your kind of, what's your take-home message for them when they first sit down and think about, I'm going to build a simulation? What would be, rather than start running around in MATLAB and getting excited and start trying to produce phenomenal equations or something, would there be a moment that they should just sit quietly for 5 minutes and think about things for a while?
Oh yes, certainly. Well, again, I realise that may not be terribly helpful, but I don't think there's one grand message to take away. It really depends on the case that you're looking at, but maybe that is the message. Sort of, Maslow once said that if your only tool is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. And sort of that's a frequent problem. You learn certain things, you come with a certain toolbox from your studies, and you want to use all these nice fancy things. So sit down and look at what is the case at hand that you're actually dealing with. So what's the reality on the ground? Second, figure out what do you actually want to do. That's a frequent confusion in model building. People start out, and we have been talking about this during this interview, start out building a tool for thought or a little explanatory model. You want to understand qualitative effects. And suddenly, one morning people get up and say, oh no, let's generate predictions. So predictive models and explanatory models are often not the same models. So there's different criteria, there's different mechanisms used and so on. So I guess the piece of advice would really be never lose sight of the target system you're dealing with, and never lose sight of what your goals are. And if your goals change, if you're suddenly shifting from explanatory models to predictive models, then sort of warning signs should go up and say maybe you have to rethink your modeling techniques. You can't just go on with business as usual and pretend, well, it's all the same. It's very likely it's not.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure they'll appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks again for coming, and I look forward to your talk in a few moments' time. Thank you.
Thank you.